I'm honored to introduce Lorenz Lüthi, who's been my friend for 16 years. Professor Lüthi is professor at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, and he is a native of Basel, Switzerland, and earned his undergraduate degree at the University of Zurich and holds 3 degrees from Yale University. He also studied at Ohio University and has taught at university in China. And his book, The Sino-Soviet Split, has won several major awards, and Professor Lüthi is currently working still in the area of international history and history of the world in India, Vietnam, the Middle East, in Russia and the former Soviet Union, and brings a wealth of expertise, research, and knowledge and passion to today's lecture. So let's give a warm welcome to Professor Lüthi.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for the very nice and kind words. I also want to say I want to encourage you to attend the talk of Andrew Preston. He's a good friend of mine. It's a great book. So I almost met him here. Now, this is the first time that I have been here in Utah. I usually cross Utah in an airplane to California when I see friends there. Now I have the opportunity to see it on the ground, and I have an opportunity even to go skiing tomorrow, and I'm very happy. I'm actually Swiss, and of course I'm a skier. And as Mark already said, we have known each other since 1997 when I started my PhD at Yale, and he entered his 3rd year, we figured out yesterday, and his wife started together with me at Yale in the same year. And since then we have met, unfortunately, infrequently in Canada and in other places. I was invited to come and talk about the global history of the regional Cold Wars, and I just realized that I really set a large topic for myself, and I probably cannot do justice to that topic in the 35 or 40 minutes. So I decided to focus on a subset of questions which interest me at the moment very much, and that then helped to explain what I'm really doing at the moment with my new book project. Now, before I start, I would like to define a couple of terms. The term regional Cold Wars, what do I mean with that? As opposed to the systemic Cold War, that's the superpower conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States, I define regional Cold Wars as subsystemic conflicts that are either caused by the systemic conflict or they are exacerbated by that conflict. What do I mean with that? So this could be, for example, the German Cold War, the German division. That is a subsystemic Cold War. It was caused by the Cold War. The division of Germany was caused. But then it took on a life by itself when the two Germanys actually struggled with each other. So this would be a regional Cold War that is actually caused by the systemic Cold War. But there are also conflicts in the Cold War, regional conflicts, that were not caused by the Cold War, but the Cold War exacerbated them. One example is the Vietnam War, which is actually a civil war that then turns into actually a proxy war between the superpowers. Another example is the Arab-Israeli conflict, which at the beginning of the Cold War wasn't really a Cold War conflict. In fact, in 1956, the superpowers both lined up behind Egypt and forced Israel out of the Sinai. But by 1967, it had turned into a Cold War as the superpowers and their respective allies lined up almost neatly behind either Israel or actually the Arabs, with the exception of France that defied the United States and shifted its support behind Israel, and Romania that actually did not support the Arabs and kept in relationship with Israel. So nevertheless, the shape of these conflicts was really influenced by the Cold War, although the roots were not in the Cold War itself. Now, I also include conflicts within alliance blocks as regional Cold Wars. So these are mostly loyalty conflicts, which then have an impact on that regional Cold War or on the Cold War as a systemic conflict. For example, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, or China and the Soviet Union, or France and the United States. These are all conflicts within actually the blocks that, however, define just haggling between a smaller and a larger ally. So the tail wagging the dog syndrome, where a smaller ally tries to blackmail a hegemon to extract actually concessions and material aid. These relationships, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, China to the Soviet Union, France and the United States, are not really small-scale conflicts. There are fundamental conflicts within actually the Western or the socialist world. Now keep in mind that not all conflicts that happen in the Cold War are Cold War conflicts. But there are conflicts that are independent actually from the Cold War, and that they are not caused and not exacerbated by the Cold War, but they just happen in the period of the Cold War. That doesn't make them Cold War conflicts. Nevertheless, we should keep in mind that the Cold War was pervasive. It had an impact on many conflicts and often in unexpected manners. Let me just give you one example. In 1961, 28 countries, I think, met in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. At the conference, this was the first non-alignment conference, the first conference of the emerging non-alignment movement. Now, the nature of the movement was non-alignment. You are not going to enter into any relationship with the two superpowers, with either the one or the other superpower. You try to stay out of the superpower conflict. Now, the Belgrade conference happened in early September 1961, just in the wake of the Berlin crisis, when East Germany decided to build up what would become the Berlin Wall, basically to physically separate the two Germanys. This was a very brutal act, and East Germany tried in the 17 days until the conference met in Belgrade to basically push the non-alignment movement, to put the German issue on its agenda. Of course, it has nothing to do with the non-alignment movement. And luckily, the non-alignment movement refused to put it on the agenda. However, it could not escape the Cold War, because the day before that conference opened, literally the day before, Khrushchev announced the resumption of nuclear testing, breaking a 3-year moratorium with the United States. Now, he did it in order to basically support East Germany and the division basically to support East Germany in the context of the Berlin crisis. But he essentially forced the issue of nuclear weapons onto the agenda of the non-alignment movement. And it threw the whole movement, the whole conference in disarray. It led to very acrimonious debates at that Belgrade conference. So it is a very clear case where the Cold War imposes itself on and creates conflicts in a realm that should not be, or was supposed not to be actually a Cold War theater. Now, in my new project, I'm interested in exploring not only these regional Cold Wars individually, but I'm more interested in how they interact with each other. So I'm interested not only in their relationship to a systemic Cold War, but in their relationship to each other. How do subsystemic systems relate to each other and form actually a second layer of system that sort of is an alternative to the systemic Cold War? Now, I'm firmly convinced that it makes sense to understand these conflicts in a larger international conflict and to see how different conflicts intersect with each other and create new conflicts or maybe even new solutions to old conflicts. I call this I suggest that we think about these connections in terms of a network, in which one event leads to cascading events through the whole network that intersect with other cascading events that have been caused by other events in other geographical areas. So think about a fishing net where you sort of pull at one node, but this then has a cascading effect to all neighboring nodes and through large parts of that fishing net. So I have clarified some of my ideas and some of the terms, and let me just now jump into the actual talk. I decided here to focus on one event, one I know quite well because I wrote a book about it. That's the Sino-Soviet split, but I will not really talk about it. I will mostly talk about these cascading effects that split had on the international system in various parts of that system. So in the end, I'm talking about the worldwide consequences of the Sino-Soviet split. Now, before I do that, I have to talk very briefly about why the Sino-Soviet relationship collapsed. the newly established People's Republic of China entered into an alliance with the Soviet Union in early 1950. It was seen in the West as a threatening alliance that would basically shift initiative from the West to the socialist world. However, within 10 years, it was clear that this alliance was falling apart. By 1960, the internal disagreements were made public by the Chinese, and by the mid-60s, it was quite clear that this alliance had collapsed. Now, I will just now cover a couple of things that are relevant to the rest of my talk. And these are essentially why this split occurred, why this relationship collapsed. One reason is, in my view, that China saw this relationship always as a temporary relationship and not as a long-term relationship. It needed military security, it needed economic aid from the Soviet Union. Through that relationship, it actually got both. But in the long term, it wanted to become an independent actor in international relations again, the way it had been in the glorious past, as the self-description was. So China wanted to restore itself through the Soviet Union to former greatness and glory after a century of imperialist humiliation. So, to a certain degree, for China, this relationship was instrumental. But that means this relationship would, at one point, wane anyway. But this still does not explain why it actually collapsed in such great bitterness on both sides. This is related to the fact that the alliance, in my view, had different meanings to the Soviet Union and to China. For China, the alliance was the defining moment through which it established itself in international relations. By entering the socialist camp or the socialist world, it made its position in international relations clear, and it became an international actor. Now, for the Soviet Union, the alliance was an accidental alliance. It didn't expect this alliance. It didn't work for it. It's, to a certain degree, fell into its lap over the summer of 1949. It fell into its lap after the Soviet Union had suffered several defeats in its foreign relations towards Europe. It essentially means that the alliance played a different role in the two countries when it comes to self-identity. For China, it was the defining moment. For the Soviet Union, it was just another asset among many assets it had already gathered. Now, as this relationship started to collapse, China had to redefine itself, its own self-identity, because its self-identity was tied up with that alliance. And this is the reason why China used so much energy and time and effort in these public debates and public attacks on the Soviet Union. It was an act of redefinition of self-identity. For the Soviet Union, the alliance wasn't really relevant to its self-identity, and this explains why, to a certain degree, the Soviet Union was quite negligent when it came to the maintenance of this alliance. And once the alliance collapsed, it really didn't know what this whole collapse was about. However, again, I don't believe that these considerations can explain why this alliance collapsed in such bitterness. And here, I believe this has something to do with the ideology, with Marxism-Leninism, to which the two sides professed to adhere. It formed the basis of the alliance. This is why China entered into an alliance with the Soviet Union, because it was a fellow Marxist-Leninist state. But I also believe that the ideology then provided the seedlings for the split. Now let's think a little bit about Marxism-Leninism. Now, when you read Marxist-Leninist texts about world revolution, they are very ambivalent about some of the core visions of Marx and Lenin. This is, how are you going to achieve the communist end? They always talk about the communist end of history, but they never tell you how to get there. So this is the big gap in the theory. How do you get there? And a lot of the discussions between the Chinese and the Soviets in the 50s and 60s is about finding the correct path towards the communist end of history. Now there's this level of ambivalence. On the other hand, Marxism-Leninism makes claims in principle about the nature of politics. So on the one hand, you have ambivalence. On the other hand, you have claims in principle. And this makes any disagreement on theory a disagreement in principle. And this is, of course, why, in my view, the Sino-Soviet split was more than just a disagreement about, some texts, and these texts were used as window dressing, and it masquerades, a much deeper conflict. I think this ideology, that's the kernel actually of the disagreement. These substantive disagreements are ideological disagreements, and we have to take them seriously. And they explain then a lot why this disagreement, this split, had such an effect through the international system, because these are the ideological claims in principle about the nature of the international system. Now then, there are a couple of other things that might have contributed to the split. Personalities. Now, Mao Zedong was a very strong personality. Here we see the two actually in 1958, Mao and Khrushchev, the main participants in the split. He was very difficult to work with. Khrushchev, on the other hand, was a little volcano. He tended to blow up very quickly. His co-workers never knew what he would say the next time when he opened his mouth, so because he could change his line very quickly. So these two personalities very clearly did not work together and they met actually three times actually, in 54, 58, and 59. And in all cases, they basically did not get along very well. A more fundamental problem is that Mao was older than Khrushchev, and Mao was the leader of the Chinese Revolution, whereas Khrushchev really didn't play a bigger role in the Soviet Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution at the end of World War I. Mao always considered Khrushchev as immature, and he always looked down on him. And he increasingly used Khrushchev and Khrushchev's, let's say, underdeveloped ideas on ideology to basically move against his internal rivals. Starting in the late 50s, early 60s, Mao faced internal opposition. And the best way to deal with this internal opposition is actually to pretend that they are like Khrushchev, immature and have no clue about ideology. This, however, then required also to micromanage the demise of the alliance with the Soviets, because you needed actually a bad relationship with the Soviets in order to be able to go after your internal rivals. So there is domestic conflict that then accelerates the split. Now, in sum, the Sino-Soviet split was a combination of long-term and short-term factors. While the nature of the alliance and the Chinese purpose of entering it for instrumental purposes did not presage a long-lasting partnership, these two traits also did not predetermine the course and the bitterness of the breakup as it unfolded in the 1960s. The Sino-Soviet split occurred as the result of genuine ideological disagreements coupled with Mao's abuse of the faltering alliance for domestic purposes and to additional secondary factors such as personality conflicts or accidental outside incidents. Now, this is the basis from which I want to start in my talk. At this point, I would like to go systematically through some of the consequences of the Sino-Soviet split externally. I'm not going to talk about the internal consequences like the Cultural Revolution, because that's quite well known. And there are four I would like to cover. The impact on the socialist world, the impact on relations in South Asia, that's India and Pakistan, on the Afro-Asian world, that's the larger developing world as it emerges in the 1950s and 1960s, and in the Western world. So let me start just with the socialist world. Okay, here it is. The Sino-Soviet split had major impacts on actually Eastern Europe, here, particular actually on Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and East Germany, but also actually on Vietnam and the Vietnam War. One of the problems is that when Khrushchev attacks Stalin in his famous secret speech in February 1956, which is designed to start de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union, he sanctions a certain degree of ideological pluralism within the socialist world. So Stalin, or his word, doesn't really have the weight it used to have. Stalin is not any longer the ultimate arbiter in the relationships among the socialist worlds, or those who interpret Stalin's words. Now Khrushchev, by attacking him, by showing that he is actually fallible, removes that claim to superiority. And it means that all these countries that have suffered from Stalinism now have to start to deal individually with the legacy of Stalinism. And they all do that in various ways. So they start to look at alternatives towards Stalinism. And to a certain degree, this leads to a limited pluralistic debate about ideology within the socialist world. Mao decides to embark on a development model that is essentially takes Stalinist ideas of the early 1930s. The idea, the Great Leap Forward, is to use radical methods to propel China from its relative economic backwardness into modernity. And in the process, it was supposed not even to catch up with the Soviet Union, but to take over and enter the communist paradise before the Soviet Union. With that, of course, China could claim leadership in the socialist world. However, as we know, it ended in mass famines and in which millions starved to death and in economic disaster by 1960. Now, even if the Great Leap Forward within 2 years turned into a disaster, it found admirers in East Europe, particularly in Bulgaria. Bulgaria decided to launch also a Great Leap Forward and use radical rural policies to basically jump ahead economically. Now in Bulgaria, the Great Leap Forward was less extreme, but it even faltered before it faltered in China. Within 1 year, basically, Bulgaria had reached economic rock bottom. East Germany was also interested in the Great Leap Forward. East Germany had a rural production problem. It tried to adopt some of the Great Leap Forward rural policies. It even requested from China food aid. East Germany, probably a country in East Europe that was the best well-off, it asked for food aid from China. Of course, the East Germans had fallen victim to Chinese propaganda. Then eventually, as the Soviet Union increasingly is disturbed by reports from China, it clamps down on East Germany and demands a stop of pro-Chinese propaganda in East Germany. However, the country that is most affected in East Europe is in fact Albania. Albania is the first country that really has to confront the fallout between the Soviet Union and the China in 1960. And this is largely related to Albania's own difficult relationship to its much larger neighbor, Yugoslavia, which of course doesn't exist anymore, but which was one of the major East European countries because it managed to get out of the shadow of Stalin as early as 1948. It was actually expelled by Stalin from the socialist world. And Albania then tried to rapproche with the Soviet Union in order to get back at Yugoslavia. So to a certain degree, the Albanian leaning towards the Soviet Union has very much something to do with its relationship with Yugoslavia. China is actually doing this too, because Mao does not want to be seen like Tito, who is the leader of Yugoslavia after Tito had been expelled from the socialist camp. So both China and Albania have a reason to close ranks with the Soviet Union against Yugoslavia. Now, after 1956, when Khrushchev starts to, or 55 already, when Khrushchev starts to revise Stalin's foreign policies, and he seeks actually approachment with Yugoslavia, Albania and China suddenly are caught on the wrong foot. China actually follows the Soviet Union and also tries to establish relationships with Yugoslavia. Albania itself now is essentially left in the cold rain. Albania criticizes actually Khrushchev. He's the first to criticize Khrushchev for revising Stalinist policies, Albania's leader Hoxha. What happens is that when the Sino-Soviet split emerges, and China starts to criticize the Soviet Union, and both the Soviet Union and China criticize Yugoslav ideological liberalism, Albania uses this essentially to side with China. After 1960, China's most important East European ally is little, poor Albania. Mao himself said it's better to have Albania as a friend than to have the other revisionist European countries as friends. So for him, ideological purity was more important than the usefulness of the relationship. When Sino-Yugoslav rapprochement starts in 1977, the Chinese essentially drop Albania like a hot potato. and Albania is totally isolated in East Europe. So for the Chinese, for Mao, this was a very instrumental relationship, simply to get actually at the Soviet Union. Now, among the all socialist countries, North Vietnam is the one socialist country that probably suffered most from the Sino-Soviet split. The Sino-Soviet split emerges in the early 1960s, just at the time when North Vietnam decides to on a military solution of reunification. So with the Geneva Agreements in 1954, both Vietnams had agreed that they would hold elections within 2 years that would then lead to reunification. The South actually torpedoed these elections, knowing that probably the communists would win in the South, and this would lead to a reunification on the communist terms. And then by 1959, North Vietnam had decided to abrogate actually the Geneva agreements and to go for a military solution, basically to force unification through military means. This happens at a time when the two most important socialist states, China and the Soviet Union, fall actually into disagreements. Now it's quite clear that after 1959, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh tries to mediate between the Soviet Union and China, and he is to a certain degree successful until 1963. However, in 1963, Khrushchev loses interest in Vietnam. He really thinks that Vietnam is not important enough, and the communists in Hanoi increasingly take sides with actually China, largely for instrumental terms. This all changes in October 1964 when Khrushchev is overthrown. Now his successors don't really change any of his policies, except the two exceptions. They change his rural policies and they change Khrushchev's hands-off policy towards Vietnam. All the other policies stay, essentially. And suddenly, the Soviet Union is willing to give massive aid to North Vietnam in the struggle that now emerges with the United States over the winter of 64-65. Now, Beijing, of course, China is in a very important geographical reason. It basically controls all the access to North Vietnam in terms of railroads and supplies. And it now fears that the Soviet Union is trying to take back control over the foreign policy and the military strategy of North Vietnam. And it leads to major conflict between the three countries about military strategy and military supplies in the struggle against the United States. Now, it's quite clear that the two sides embark in a competition of military aid. And even if the competition does increase military aid to North Vietnam, it also entails limits to how that military aid can be used by North Vietnam. So in the end, I think for Vietnam, the struggle, the Sino-Soviet split, had a negative impact on its ability to fight against what it considers American aggression. Now, Sino-American rapprochement, that is of course a result of the Sino-Soviet split, and that starts in 1964, further then undermines the relationship between Beijing and Hanoi, simply because the North Vietnamese think that the Chinese are selling out World Revolution, despite the fact that China is a loyal ally in the conflict. So to a certain degree, the Sino-Soviet split and the resulting Sino-American rapprochement have a negative impact on the ability of North Vietnam to fight the war, and it has actually a major psychological impact on the way the North Vietnamese see the behavior of China. They essentially accuse China of revisionism, of selling out the revolution, in terms in which Mao in the early 60s accused the Soviet Union of selling out the World Revolution. Now, I know time is running. Let me just talk about the second topic. This is South Asia. This is just a blow-up of this map. Now, I want to focus here on the relationship between China and India and the impact of the Sino-Soviet split on India. Now, as the largest non-socialist third world state, India naturally attracted Chinese and Soviet interest, particularly after 1953. In fact, India was crucial in bringing about actually peace talks, armistice and peace talks between North Korea and South Korea It was standing at the sideline during the Geneva conference, and it became actually a very important player in Vietnam here, largely because it was a member of the International Control Commission of the Armistice Agreement of 1954. So India is really quite involved in Korea and Vietnam, and of course China is involved too. Now, in April 1954, China and India established the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence as a working basis between socialist China and non-socialist India. This is the first agreement that regulates behavior between a socialist and a non-socialist state, how they actually treat each other. Both sides hoped that this agreement would become a model for the larger world. Of course, it didn't. Now, we see here actually, we see here Zhou Enlai and Nehru at a later meeting. This is in late 1956. This is during Zhou's triumphant visit to India, which creates this famous saying, Hindi Chini Bye Bye, the Indian-Chinese friendship. And you see here actually the young Dalai Lama, who also happens to be in India at that time on a state visit. This is really when the relationship was very good as a result of the 5 principles of coexistence. However, of course, the Soviet Union also tries to get into the game, and a little bit earlier, a year earlier, before Zhou Enlai goes the second time to India, Khrushchev actually visits India too and tries to improve relations. Now, essentially now India becomes a good friend of the Soviet Union and China at the time when the 2 communist powers start to fall actually into disagreement. The trigger here is actually Tibet. It is too far. I've just added here. Tibet is roughly here. This is Bhutan is here. This is roughly Tibet. Now, to be very clear about that, Nehru had very little sympathy for the theocratic government and the feudal government in Tibet. He thought that it is backwards and it needed reform. At the same time, he also distrusted Chinese intentions in Tibet, largely because India had long cultural and religious contacts with Tibet, and public opinion in India was such that any intervention, Chinese intervention in Tibet, would lead to a major outcry in India. The fundamental problems they had were the undemarcated borders here, particularly here and here, between Tibet, which is Chinese Tibet, and India. Now, despite Sino-Indian friendship, once the Tibetan uprising starts in early 1959, and China sends in troops appear at these borders, try to patrol borders that are essentially undemarcated. And this, of course, then leads to an Indian response. The Indians send in their troops, and very quickly they shoot at each other in 1959. So with that, the Sino-Indian friendship is, of course, over. Now, it's quite clear that the Chinese were not very happy about this. Zhou Enlai, the prime minister and foreign minister, comes to New Delhi in April 1960. We have now the full set of the talks from the Indian side and tries to iron out things. But at that time, Indian public opinion is so outraged that Nehru has no room to maneuver, and he cannot agree to any compromise deal on the borders. Now, the interesting thing is here, and this is where the Cold War comes in. How does this affect actually Pakistan? We didn't really talk about Pakistan here. Pakistan in 1954, 1955 is the most allied ally of the United States. It was actually allied twice. Once via the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which is sort of a parallel organization to NATO, with here Southeast Asian nations, largely a reaction to the conflict in Indochina, and it was also allied with Iran, Iraq, and Turkey in an alliance supposed to prevent Soviet expansion into the Middle East. So it was allied twice with the United States. This was a reason why, in fact, India got interested in the first place in close relationships with the Soviets and the Chinese. It was a reaction to Pakistani alliance politics. Now, Pakistan distrusted China completely. When The Bandung meeting, and we'll talk about the Bandung meeting of the Afro-Asian conference, was supposed to meet in April 1955. The big question is, should the Afro-Asian states invite China to that meeting as well, Communist China? Now, there were 5 organizers: India, Burma, Pakistan, Ceylon, today Sri Lanka, and actually Indonesia, that organized the Bandung conference that would actually meet in Bandung in Indonesia. Now, India and Burma both actually were for inviting China, because they thought, well, China is an Asian nation, and they were trying to bind in China into the international context, so let's invite India. Ceylon and Pakistan were against. Indonesia was ambivalent about it. They were largely against inviting China because they were strongly anti-communist. This was in 1954, 1955. After 1959, once the relationship between China and India sours, and given that Pakistan and India have a very difficult relationship, both China and Pakistan try to exploit the Sino-Indian conflict. And it comes to a rapprochement. First, China tries to break down Pakistan's relationship with the United States. That doesn't work out, but it at least can actually befriend Pakistan in a way that it can use Pakistan, which brackets India. Remember, Pakistan in 1971, there was a Western Pakistan and the Eastern Pakistan. This is a unitary nation state. So China tries essentially with military aid to Pakistan to threaten India and to deter India. So it's a very strange turn in Cold War politics in South Asia, that via the Sino-Soviet split and the Sino-Indian conflict, you suddenly have a switch of alliances to a certain degree of Pakistan. So the Cold War really matters here, the systemic and the subsystemic Cold War. Now, of course, Pakistan is absolutely crucial in bringing China and the United States together. In 1971, it was the Pakistani back channel, through which actually Nixon and Kissinger could get in contact with Chinese leadership. Of course, the Pakistanis didn't do that because they loved the Americans or the Chinese. They did that largely because they needed more military aid. At that time, there was a rebellion in eastern Pakistan against the bad, actually, administration run by Western Pakistanis, military and civilian administration. This would lead to a civil war in which India then intervenes in late 71, and it leads to the breakup of Pakistan. Of course, Pakistan tries to appeal to both China and the United States to support Pakistan against India, but it's going to lose that conflict. But this is the motivation for Pakistan to help to bring China and the United States together in the first place. So here the Cold War, works in several ways in this whole story. Eventually, Pakistan is broken up. Bangladesh emerges in 1971, 1972. And interestingly, very, very quickly, the United States and China basically drop Pakistan like a hot potato. No interest in Pakistan anymore. It's not actually worthwhile anymore to support Pakistan for geostrategic reasons. This leads to a major identity crisis of Pakistan because it now cannot play the game anymore. And this is one of the reasons why in the 1970s Pakistan starts to engage actually with Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, and starts to engage also internally with Islamist politicians. And when you now think that through, this is also the reason why Pakistan is then so central in organizing Islamist resistance against the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan after 1979. But this is all, to a certain degree, an echo of the Sino-Soviet split. It leads to a whole cascade of events, the outcome of which is that Pakistan supports Islamists in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And this is one of the major points I tried to make, to see how events actually fit to each other and create totally unexpected outcomes. Now, I know I'm running out of time. I have still something like 8 minutes. I very quickly want to talk about the Afro-Asian world. I just found this map in the online National Archives of Australia. These are the countries that attended the Afro-Asian meeting in 1955 in Bandung. Bandung is here in the mountains south of actually Jakarta. It's a very important conference. It's the first conference where really development states meet and talk about issues of development. There are some precursor conferences, and I can talk about them. I just do research at them right now, but it's really a very important seminal conference, a Third World Conference. Now, I already talked about Bandung several times. I talked also about why China was invited, because India and Burma wanted to have China there. For China, this engagement in Bandung didn't really translate into a lot of results. This is also related to a certain degree to the fact that China is turning inward after 55 and then turns toward the Great Leap Forward. So China, to a certain degree, loses interest in the Afro-Asian world in the second half of the 50s for internal reasons. This, however, all changes in 1962. Again, the Sino-Soviet split matters here, and Mao's attempt to tie his internal rivals to actually the Soviet Union, to the Soviet enemy now. And what he tries to do is he tries to basically limit interaction with the socialist world, and Mao tries to claim to become the leader of the Third World. He wants now the Chinese Revolution to become a model for the emerging Third World, particularly for Africa. This has, in my view, domestic reasons why he makes this claim. Because if he cannot manage to claim leadership of the socialist world, he now tries to claim leadership of the developing world, and this makes his position internally untouchable to a certain degree. China can benefit from the fact that there is a war, the second the Chinese-Indian War in late 1962, in which India is totally humiliated by Chinese troops. I think that was also the reason why China did attack India. But India also made a strategic mistake. It turns to Great Britain and the United States for military aid. And with that, of course, it discredits its own position within the Third World. It turns to a former imperialist power, and it turns to the United States, which is a part of the systemic Cold War. In the wake of this reorientation of Chinese foreign policy, Zhou Enlai goes on what is often dubbed as Zhou Enlai's safari to Africa. In late 63 and 64, he basically travels to the Middle East, to North Africa, to Tanzania, to Ethiopia, to Somalia, to Sudan. And it's an attempt at basically convincing these third world powers of actually China's intentions, good intentions. I unfortunately didn't find a picture of Zhou Enlai in Tanzania, and I will talk about that visit in a minute. This is actually near visiting China in the early 1970s. But it's quite clear what China wants to achieve with this travel diplomacy. It wants to try to get into control of the Afro-Asian movement. And it wants to impose its own positions, its anti-Soviet, anti-American, and anti-Indian position onto the Afro-Asian movement, and essentially dominate the agenda of the developing world. To a certain degree, it is successful until the summer of 1965. In the summer of 1965, on June 5th, 1965, Zhou Enlai visits Tanzania, and he gives a very famous speech where he basically says that Africa and Asia are ripe for revolution, of course, for communist revolution. Now, this makes sense to make this statement in Nyerere Tanzania, which is anyway Nyerere. Tanzania has just gotten independence, is moving towards the left. It also makes sense against the background of what is going on in China. You know, the run-up to the Cultural Revolution, the radicalization of domestic politics, which Mao actually pushes for his own goals. But it really alienates most of the other African states, because they're all post-actually independent states. It's just the elites that led these states into independence. They are now in power. And now Zhou Enlai comes and says, overthrow these goons. They are not good enough. You know, you have to install now communist successor regimes in Africa. The result is that very quickly, this half of the African states that had recognized China basically cut recognition within 6 months. So essentially, Zhou Enlai had overplayed his hand. Then from Tanzania, he travels via some other African states to Egypt. Here we see him together with Nasser. Fundamental problem is, in this story, that he is in actually Egypt at the time when the Algerian revolutionary leader Ben Bella is overthrown. Zhou Enlai had established very close relationships with Ben Bella. And the second Bandung conference was supposed to meet later in June and early July in Algiers. That means basically Ben Bella was supposed to be the host. Ben Bella is overthrown in a coup at home because he had moved too much to the left for the other Algerian independence leaders. Now, Zhou Enlai is in Egypt, is talking with Nasser when the news comes that Algeria basically has a change of leadership. Nasser is absolutely happy about that because Nasser doesn't like Ben Bella. Ben Bella is a left-wing rival for pan-Arabist leadership in the Arab world. So Nasser is absolutely happy that Ben Bella is gone, whereas Zhou Enlai loses his most important ally actually in the Arab world. I have the transcripts of the Chinese transcripts of the talks, and it's absolutely fascinating how they talk to each other. And it's quite clear that Nasser gleefully, even in English, tells Zhou Enlai Ben Bella is history. And he really enjoys that very moment. So again here, the Cold War plays a role. If Zhou Enlai, if the Chinese had not decided to engage in the Third World as a result of the Sino-Soviet split, it would not have come to this conflict in the Afro-Asian movement. Very quickly, Nasser plays his own game. Subsequently, he decides to invite the Soviet Union to the meeting, the second Bandung meeting that has been postponed as a result of the Ben Bella coup. And once the Chinese realized that Nasser had switched sides, they basically tried to torpedo and then sabotage the meeting, and it never actually happens. And with that, the Afro-Asian meeting is dead, or the Afro-Asian movement is dead. To a certain degree, so what the Chinese couldn't control, they are quite happy then to destroy in the logic of the Cold War. So I have roughly 1 page left. The last thing what I wanted to talk about is, of course, the rapprochement with the West. Now, revolutionary fervor, which was the result, in fact, of the Sino-Soviet split, had ruined China's standing in Africa and to a certain degree in Asia. However, this was also a time where China needed economic aid in order to overcome the disasters of the Great Leap Forward. This was particularly necessary because in the summer of 1960, Khrushchev, in one of his really bad decisions, decided to withdraw all the Soviet economic specialists that helped China's economy. So in fact, China not only faced the fallout of the Great Leap Forward, but it also had to face the fact that the Soviets were withdrawing economic aid. This forced the Chinese leaders to turn towards the West, particularly West Europe and Japan. And it's one of the reasons why, in fact, China starts to reintegrate into the outside world already in the 1960s via actually economic contacts. Within 5 years, the Soviet Union, which held around 50% of China's foreign economic relations, loses all of its foreign relations. It goes down to 0 by 1965. And within the same period, Japan gathers 15% of China's foreign trade from 0, plus around 10 or 12% of the UK and West Germany. So essentially, Japan, the UK, and West Germany more or less replace the trade with the Soviet Union within 5 years. It's a major reorientation of China's foreign trade. Now, China, of course, is not only in need of technological assistance, it's actually in need of food aid as a result of the Great Leap Forward. And it's willing to trade with Australia, with Canada, even with the United States to get grain. So it does not officially trade with the United States. The trade goes via France and Albania officially. But US grain is literally delivered to Albania, where it's reloaded into Chinese ships and then brought actually to China. The Chinese didn't want US ships to dock actually in Shanghai or in Tianjin. Now, this is also the time where then China tries to establish not only economic contacts with the West, but also establish diplomatic contacts. In this period falls also the establishment of Sino-French relations, and both sides have their own reasons why they do that at the time they do it, but nothing really comes out. Both sides get very quickly frustrated because there are no results. Now, this is, of course, the stage on which this happens, and you probably all waited for that. When I talk about the Sino-Soviet split, I have to talk about Sino-American rapprochement. Now, the reason why I talk about this last is not only just to make it a little bit more interesting to you and let you wait and raise the expectations. My interpretation is that, in fact, the United States is a latecomer to the game. It realizes at the very end what game the other regional Cold War players, particularly the West Europeans and Japan, are playing. And the Americans realize to a certain degree that they have either joined them or to miss the boat. This is my interpretation. Of course, the Sino-Soviet split helps the Americans. What really helps the Americans that by March 1969, the Chinese and the Soviets not only talk to each other, but they start to shoot at each other. There are actually border conflicts in the very east here, between the Amur region, between actually Manchuria and this is, I think, the Primoria, the most eastern. What do you call it? District or province? Province, yeah, of the Soviet Union, Krai. This really jolts the Americans into action. And at the end of 1969, they actually start to talk to each other in the Chinese embassy in Warsaw in Poland. However, this is delayed again, largely because of events in Vietnam. In March 1970, the Americans decide actually to bomb North Vietnamese supply lines that are in Cambodia. They extend the war, the Vietnam War, in Cambodia. And this is a reason for the Chinese to pull back for a while. They actually consider to approach with the Soviet Union for a couple of months, but then realized this is not going to work out, and then they switch back and send signals to the Americans. We are really interested in approachment. Eventually, the Americans get the message, particularly through ping-pong diplomacy in early 1971, and then through the Pakistani back channel. Here, the Pakistanis are crucial in shuttling back and forth and sending the messages, and this leads then to, of course, Kissinger's secret visit to Beijing in July of 1971, after which the Nixon visit to China is announced. And I choose this picture for a reason, because this is really the ultimate consequence of the Sino-Soviet split. This is Zhou Enlai coming down the stairs, walking towards Nixon coming down the stairs, walking towards Zhou Enlai, extending his hand, and you see Zhou Enlai sort of is a little bit hesitant. He doesn't know how to take that. The symbolism is here that in 1954, at the Geneva Conference, Dulles, the Secretary of State of the United States, refused to shake hands with Zhou Enlai. And the Chinese always made this into a propaganda thing. You know, the Americans refused to shake hands with us. And this is why Nixon comes down and makes this leap. And in the film, it's actually really a leap and shakes the hand in order actually to erase that stain from the record. Of course, this visit is more symbolic than substantial. Relations between the two do not improve dramatically. They only improve in 1978, when, under the impression of Vietnamese interests in Cambodia, the Vietnamese, after unification, have designs on Cambodia and then move into Cambodia in late 78 to remove Pol Pot. This leads then to a very quick rapprochement between the Americans and the Chinese, and then to mutual recognition on January 1st, 1979, and the famous Deng Xiaoping return visit to the White House. So let me just very quickly talk about what I conclude. So the Sino-Soviet split had really unexpected consequences across the world. There's an impact on East Europe, there's an impact on the course of the Vietnam War, there's a major impact on South Asia, on particular Pakistani behavior, and then even an echo in Afghanistan. There's a major impact on the Afro-Asian world. China tried to seize leadership in the Afro-Asian world, and by doing so, it destroyed actually the Afro-Asian movement. There's an impact on China's relationship with the West in terms of economic relations in the 60s, and then eventually the opening towards the West and towards the United States. So in many respects, I could go on now and show you where the impact is in the 70s and 80s, but in many respects, we have to think about major events in terms of cascading effects to understand where these effects are and how they intersect with other developments in the Cold War. So this is my basic idea I wanted to convey today, and I'm sorry for running that late, and thank you for staying here with me. Are there any questions?
Sorry. I wonder if you might comment on the current Russian-Chinese rapprochement, and is this somewhat of a natural product now the ideology is out of the way, and you have two regional powers who aspire to be global powers seeing eye to eye?
Thank you. In short, I don't think so. It's natural, and I don't think that they look eye to eye. I think it's very instrumental. The Chinese pretend that they respect the Russians, but what they're really interested in is actually Central Asia and Siberia, basically the raw materials there, oil and gas. And the Russians, they pretend that they are a great power, and they pretend that they are treated as an equal with the Chinese, and they fall into the trap. That's my interpretation. I don't know whether we agree on that one, but I think the Chinese play a very cynical game, and it's not a natural alignment.
Very nice, broad overview. I enjoyed it very much. This question is specifically about the Sino-Soviet split that we date generally 1960. In your talk, you seem to imply that it was China that decided to split because they wanted to redefine themselves more ideologically. And they saw the Sino-Soviet alliance as more as a temporary arrangement. But, excuse me, in my mind, the real sort of the exclamation mark on the Sino-Soviet split was Khrushchev's decision to withdraw Soviet aid and technicians, which would lead me more to conclude that the Soviet Union, because of their suspicions of Mao's radicalism, were the ones who precipitated the split. So how do you balance who precipitated the split in that period?
Well, I wrote a whole book about that. So, and sort of this is, of course, my home turf. When I say 1960, what I mean is this is in April 1960s is when the disagreements become public, and the world is confronted with the fact that the two communist powers don't agree, don't see eye to eye. Now, I agree that Khrushchev's withdrawal in 1960 this was in July, and the withdrawal was terminated in August, of the economic advisors had a symbolic impact. In fact, I don't believe that these economic advisors had a big influence. 1,300, and they were not in strategically important ministries, and they were not into agriculture. So it had zero impact actually on an economy that had anyway already collapsed. But it was symbolically very important because it meant the abandonment of by the Soviet Union of China. Now, I tried to trace that a little bit. This is a very stupid decision by Khrushchev, and he takes it by his own, and he is attacked for it internally, it's quite clear. But the Soviets by then had already started to actually trace how many times the Chinese had broken contracts. It's a long list. It was not that the Soviets suddenly break contracts and the Chinese were basically innocent. They had done everything, the Chinese, to provoke the Soviets into doing this. Intentionally or not intentionally, that's a different discussion. I pretty much place Mao's decision to cut the relationship into late 1959. He reviews this relationship. He realizes he got everything he could get from the Soviets. The Soviets wouldn't get more military aid, maybe some more military aid, but definitely not more economic aid. The nuclear issue, that was, of course, on October 1st. That's the 10th anniversary of the PRC. I write about that. There's a very famous picture in the New York Times about Khrushchev and Mao waving down to the military parade on Tiananmen, and they look into two different directions, which sort of symbolizes actually where they stand. But it's at in this particular conversation they have on the top of Tiananmen that Khrushchev basically tells Mao, we are going to withdraw our nuclear offers. And he did that at the time when he had just returned from the United States, where he had met Eisenhower, and he was totally enthralled by Eisenhower, what a great president. And the whole talk on Tiananmen, Khrushchev only talks about how great the United States is. Just imagine you're Mao Zedong, you're celebrating the 10th anniversary of a society which you consider an utopian alternative to American imperialism. And there comes this Soviet leader who only talks about how great the United States is, and then ends that discussion with telling you, by the way, we are withdrawing our nuclear aid. doesn't really improve the relationship. But by then the relationship had become already very difficult. And it's in the wake of this event and other events that Mao by late 1959 decides essentially he doesn't need this relationship anymore. And then it's about, how can you use the breakdown of this relationship for your domestic action needs? How can you micromanage it, exploit it, that you get the greatest what would you call the greatest benefit in your struggle against your mostly invented internal rivals? Mao probably had some form of a persecution complex at that time. He thought that his rivals were out there to get him. I don't think so that this was the case, but he was convinced, and this is why he needs this breakdown of this alliance, and that very clearly happens before the withdrawal in June 1960.
Where do you see the Russian and Chinese relationship going in the future, in the next 20, 30 years?
If I knew, I would tell you now. I can speculate. And, I can always say I'm a historian and look backwards, and I'm not a political scientist and look forward, right? But that's an easy excuse. This is a relationship that, on the Chinese side, is rooted in economic interests. And on the Russian side, in my view, on a self-perceived need to restore Russia to greatness. And the Russians believe, in my view, that they can instrumentalize China to get into this, position of greatness which they miss. I think when I talk about they, I talk about Putin and the people around Putin. It will be an unequal alliance, an unequal relationship, just reverse, while the relationship between the Soviet Union and China in the 50s were unequal in the way that the Soviet Union provided all the materials and all the economic aid and all the material aid and so on. It will be unequal that China will be dominating, and it will be to the detriment of Russia. I think Russia will find itself in a situation where it's economically dependent on China, and particularly in strategic resources, and it will regret embracing China in the way it does it right now. That's my personal interpretation. So I don't see that this will be a rosy relationship. I see it as one that will be very difficult and to the detriment of Russia.
What about the relationship with Mongolia and Kazakhstan? They're right there and were rarely mentioned.
I'm currently working on India, so this is now really a stretch. I don't believe that that the Chinese leaders are sort of romantics that now follow a policy that aims at getting back the territories they supposedly lost in the 19th and the early 20th century. So I think they perfectly well can live with a Mongolia as outer Mongolia, or Mongolia as it exists. They anyway have major economic control in Mongolia today. This is what they essentially want, and with that they can manipulate what they want to manipulate. Kazakhstan, I think that's a more difficult question. Kazakhstan, of course, tries to play the game of keeping Russia at the long arm, but that means that they have to bring the Chinese into the boat. The Chinese use Kazakhstan to basically outmaneuver the Russians. The Kazakhs probably will find themselves at one point also in a very difficult position. I don't think so that while China is not romantic, it also is not a country that really cares about its neighbors as long as it can get what it wants. It's very self-centered and narcissistic, I think. It doesn't really care about the politics of Central Asia and trying to reconcile the conflicts there. There are really tight-fisted economic interests it pursues, and they might create political conflict in that region in the long term. Not intentionally. The Chinese don't intend this, but I think this is the outcome. I think this is a very cynic foreign policy the Chinese pursue at the moment. Thank you for staying. Thank you for coming.